There's a red button.
The SWAT team comes in, right?
Yeah, right. Guns ablazing.
Actually, that could be useful. Okay, I am on. I can hear myself. So I'm calling to order the October 2nd, 2019 meeting of the Planning Commission. May we start with the Pledge of Allegiance? Commissioner, I forgot your name. No.
I mean, so should I say my name
Pastor.
before I speak every time?
Yes.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, could we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
Here.
Commissioner Fresco.
Here.
Commissioner Landris.
Here.
Commissioner
Present.
Present.
Here.
and Chair
Lambert.
Lambert.
Here.
You were very quiet during
It's
that.
only been a month.
Jane.
Okay, Planning Director's report, please.
Good evening,
I
Commission. So your next meeting is October 16th. We will have a variance application at 156 Fraser. We will also that night present a Planning Commission study session to provide you an update on the 2019 legislative session on housing bills, and also talk about the progress update on the housing element, sixth cycle housing element that will be coming up as well. So there's a lot going on in that arena, so we wanted to make sure the commission was updated. And then on October 17th, there's a studies session workshop for the Wilshire Corridor Safety Study, and that will be in the Civic East Wing at 7 p.m. And that's a special Planning Commission meeting. So November 6th, October 17th.
The day after.
Yeah. And so we need at least 4 of you all. Yeah. Jing's saying it's not voluntary, so in case.
It's not voluntary. If you want your $30 for the meeting, you have to be
Exactly. We will be taking roll. Then the next meeting after that, November 6th, that's also a special meeting in the East Wing of the Civic Auditorium. That night we'll have 1304 15th Street, which is a MUP appeal. And then a CUP for a dog kennel at 1639 9th Street. It's also it's for the kennel and then also a parking issue on that property. And then coming up at City Council on October 15th, we are taking an ordinance to create a construction mitigation plan ordinance. For most large projects, certainly DAs and development review permits, we require a construction mitigation plan. But since more projects now are through administrative approval process, we want to impose that requirement on those projects as well. Really helps in the downtown and helps to keep sidewalks open and those kind of things. And that same evening at council, amendments to the AHPP and to extend the option to provide extremely low income units. And then on October 22nd will be the R1 update, and then also some Mills Act contracts. And that concludes my report.
Anyone questions of the director? I have a couple. In our meeting the other day, there were 2 items. One was a housing element status report in terms of, I know we're not there yet, but exactly what is the process that we are going to lay out and the timing for preparing the next housing element, which is coming up. And obviously we know that the RENA numbers are going to be a lot higher than what we're used to.
Right, so that's the discussion for October 16th.
Did you say that?
Yes.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
no problem.
And I guess part of that is, I understand, and I've had this explained to me and I still don't get it, that there's a study going on right now by HRNA of the Affordable Housing Protection Program and how effective it is, whether it should be amended, blah, blah, blah. But it's not a rezoning study. It's just if it comes down to we're going to have to do some serious thinking about rezoning in order to meet the RENA numbers, when does that happen and how does it interplay with the AHPP undertaking?
So that's so the work we're doing now is the feasibility we were told by council, go forward and do some feasibility testing for a different way to look at affordable housing citywide, so everywhere but the downtown.
Mhm.
So that's what that study is, and for us to test different affordable housing levels based on current standards. The reason we're bringing forward the conversation about what's going on at the state level and the sixth cycle element and our progress update on housing policy work is to start to introduce, I think, maybe that conversation about, because we don't know what we don't know yet in terms of our RENA allocation. We won't know until January. And I think that we will be presenting on the 16th kind of our initial, very preliminary look at suitable sites and that kind of thing. So I think that'll be the crux of the discussion on the 16th. Is
I guess my point,
our understanding of
and maybe there's a logical answer to this, is I don't know how you can do an AHPP analysis without it looking at potential upzoning because the economics change.
Well, I don't think we have not been authorized to do that work yet. We're just starting the discussion based on what we know of what's in front of us. And I don't know the conclusion of that, and I think that's why we need to start talking about it, because our housing element cycle comes due fall of 2021,
right.
and we need to start now in terms of starting the conversation on getting the work started at least.
I guess worst case scenario is if we do, I'm not saying we are or not, upzone certain areas of the city, that there may have to be a relook at the AHPP feasibility given that action. So I'd hate to have to
And
go
that
back
may
to
be
the
the
drawing
case, yeah.
board and do that. But
Yeah, we don't know. We don't have all the information at this moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'd also add that following the Planning Commission study session on that issue, we will also be having a City Council study session within the next few months. We don't know
Cool.
exactly when that will
Cool.
be. But as Jing is saying, we have direction to do what we're doing now from council, and there may be more direction that comes out of a future council discussion.
And then finally on that point, will the AHPP feasibility and whatever it's called come to the Planning Commission?
Yeah, it will be. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then finally, you guys said the other day that St. Monica's was going to be in November. Are we still on that track?
We are.
The DA?
Well, we're meeting with them, and I think we're targeting, but it's tentative at the moment. So
Okay.
Yeah.
But we're on it.
we're on
We're
it.
on it.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
My usual request, seismic report.
Yeah, we don't have that scheduled yet. We will, once we have a date, we will let the commission know when that's going to be, but it will be within the next couple of months.
Can we speed that up? Is there anything holding it back?
It's just, we need to talk to Ariel Sakaris, who's the building manager, about when he's available and when he'd be prepared to give that report. But it's on our list, and we'll make sure that it's before the commission soon.
Okay.
Vice Chair Landers.
I think if I'm not mistaken, we had talked about doing a combination seismic update with a briefing on the new construction code, so that we'd get the benefit of Mr. Scaris while he's here for the whole conversation. Just two clarifying questions, two things. One is, can you clarify the item that's coming on the 15th related to the AHPP rules? That's so the action that council took eliminating the option of using extremely low as opposed to very low expires at some point. I assume sometime in November.
27th.
I'm sorry.
November 27th.
November 27th.
So the reason it has to go to council on the 15th is to provide them the opportunity to basically say, do we continue this or not? Because
Okay.
if we don't bring it then it will expire without them having had a chance to even weigh in
Right.
on that. So
Okay, so if they take no action, it expires, or they can act to extend it,
right,
as they did last week with the R1
correct.
IZO.
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
And then my question, by way of slipping in a planning commissioner announcement, when we get the mobility, we also discussed this last week, but when we get the mobility update in early January-ish, I hope we'll hear about the work on Stewart and Colorado and some of the other places where those of us who are at the Pico Walk bike walk shop heard some really interesting work that the city is doing related to mobility. So including, I think, the first parking protected bike lane. So I hope that will be included.
We'll make sure that's part of
Okay.
it.
Okay. Commissioner McKinnon.
The 16th and the housing, is that open enough to discuss issues such as where there might need to be some changes in zoning, or is it a more narrow cast event?
We intend it to be an update and a broad discussion. We're thinking through, I think, some guiding questions. You know, it's just so we don't have a free ranging all over the place. I know you all love that, but
I was just
you know,
thinking that sounded pretty good, actually.
yeah, but
Jim Reese is on it too. Yeah, wow.
We're there.
How much enjoyment would that be?
yeah. So I think we're thinking through like kind of some questions that we can pose to you, that would be helpful for
Because
for
having
direction
sat here
setting.
both for the DCP and the zoning update, and then what brought it into relief was PICO last time, it's very clear that we do need to make some changes arising out of that if we want more affordable housing or more housing for every income level in the city. And so I don't want that to be precluded. I want us to be able to talk about that and then move it forward pretty urgently.
Yeah, it's an introduction. I want to caution we don't have all the data yet, so it's an update, and I think that we want to start the conversation. We have to start it at this point, and we will provide you a progress on work that has been done to date. And I think your response level will probably be commensurate to the level of information that we provide you, in terms of what's happening legislatively and on the policy level and on the work that we're doing.
Thank you.
I just want to clarify that if the city council chooses to stay with the elimination of extremely low income, that doesn't mean you can't build extremely low income, because clearly CCSM has to be competitive for tax credits. Correct? Okay.
So I have a follow-up on Commissioner McKinnon's question. It would be really helpful if in whatever is sent to us in advance of the 16th to have, even if it's just copies of prior action taken, a sense of what the parameters have been set. So, for example, I know that council a little while ago took some action related to encouraging housing in the Bergamot area plan and looking at the affordability of housing. So understanding what the policy parameters are as we're going into that conversation would be really helpful as a preparatory tool.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. The next item, I hope there are no announcements, are there? I don't want to discourage people, but I know you did. Okay. Approval of minutes, there are none. And item 7 is adoption of a statement of official action, which I can't participate in because I wasn't there. Commissioner Landris.
Yes, I just want to note that we have a slight amendment to that STOA, which is to clarify in the project description that the applicant had volunteered if the project does end up being on site, that it will be that they will voluntarily provide case management and or support services using the standard language that we have always used prior to the issuing of the COO. But otherwise, we had thrown in a lot of conditions and expectations, and I think as far as I could tell, and I believe as far as Commissioner Pastor could tell, we're in good shape, if
Okay.
I'm not mistaken.
Is there a motion
Yes,
to...
I'll move to approve as amended unless we need to read that extra language into the minutes. Nope. Okay.
Second.
voice vote? All in favor?
Aye.
All in opposition? And I abstain because I wasn't.
I also abstain, having been
Okay.
absent.
2 abstentions. The next item is...
I move the consent calendar unless there's something.
Excellent.
Second.
Disclosures for the consent calendar? Just making sure.
Okay, can we have a roll call vote, please?
No disclosures.
I did.
Sean,
I did.
we don't need 2 motions, do we? No.
No.
Okay. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
You can do that by voice vote.
Hello?
Consent. We can do
It's
it by voice.
consent. You can do it by voice vote.
Oh, okay, voice vote. All in favor?
Aye.
And a statement of official action.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, the next item is 9A.
So you need to tell the applicants they got approved.
The applicants, are they here?
Yes. they're
Okay,
just
then
sitting over there.
your track map was approved. You're very
Thank you.
welcome. I want to start out, before you start, Alan, with a request, and that is, we have one commissioner who has to leave early, but she's going to probably leave earlier before we're finished. But it would be good to get as much done as we can while she's here. That you focus on what exactly you want from us tonight, so that we are not here until midnight stumbling around trying to figure out what it is you want. And I understand the council's doing an IZO on this issue, so anything we can do to help that effort in a succinct way, we would be happy to do it. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that. My name is Alan Loomis, city urban designer, and I'm co-leading the Promenade 3.0 effort with my colleague Stephen Welliver from Downtown Santa Monica, Inc. So tonight's presentation, and I think Chair Lambert, given your request, I think what I'd like to suggest is we just kind of run through the full presentation, and then we could kind of come back for questions and specific comments rather than engaging in a kind of extended discussion as each item comes up, because that could lead us to be here through midnight. I'll give a brief overview of kind of where we're at, what Promenade 3.0 is, for the benefit of the two new commissioners who haven't seen previous and prior presentations, and kind of where we're at with this. But the general agenda for tonight's presentation is to get the Commission's feedback on some issues that we've encountered as we started opening up some of the zoning code topics that we wanted to explore. And so we thought it appropriate to come back to the Planning Commission and just get your feedback and kind of feelings on some of these topics before we start trying to develop a whole lot of red line language, and also to give you an update on some of the topics and issues that we've encountered as we've started looking into this. So we are, by no means do we have kind of red line proposals or anything at that point. It's very conceptual oriented conversation. And so if you have specific ideas or feedback, things you want us to look into, we're open to hearing that. If you don't have concerns on on the specific topics, you don't need to invent them. So with that, Promenade 3.0 is a comprehensive overview of 3rd Street Promenade, as most of the commissioners are aware. This is a joint effort, as I said, between the city and Downtown Santa Monica, Inc., or DTSM. We started this effort in early 2018 with a series of workshops, and really kind of launched it in late 2018 with a series of surveys of kind of the social behavior and the physical condition of the street. We've been working with Rios Clementi Hale and Gell Studios on the physical design side of this work, which is looking at the physical infrastructure of the street, and working with them and a variety of stakeholders, including the Planning Commission. We've developed this vision and goals statement. And we find it useful to always put this on the screen and speak to it every time we sort of talk about the Promenade 3.0 project, because it really helps kind of ground a lot of the conversation about what is we're trying to accomplish as we rethink what the Promenade could be. So the very top, the vision statement, you can read for yourself on the screen, or if you've got your magnifying glass, you can read the handout that I gave you, which I provided more for the purposes that you could take some notes so you could come back on particular topics. But the key term up there is that the Promenade remain the heart of downtown Santa Monica, authentically representing the community's values, culture, and economy. Authentic is a term that comes up every time we talk about the Promenade. It means a variety of different things to different people, but everybody says the Promenade should feel authentically Santa Monican. And we think that a combination of values, the city's culture, and also its economy is an important way of representing that. There are then 7 project goals that fall out of that, or kind of are supportive of that vision. Each one of these, as the commission will recall, has an analog to one of the DCP principles. And we could come back to these and go through these individually one by one if it's productive, but I think in the interest of time, I'll sort of just let them sit there and can kind of skim through them. But as I said, these have been developed in multiple times wordsmithed by a variety of stakeholders, including the Planning Commission. The Promenade 3.0 effort is organized across what we call 3 different lanes of activities. So the one lane, lane 3, is the one that gets the most amount of attention because that's where we have Rios, Clementi, Hale, and Gell Studios assisting us. They have a tendency to produce a lot of very exciting graphics and visual material and eye candy that gets everybody pretty excited. They're ultimately charged with developing a physical plan for the 3 blocks of the promenade. And so their work is really falling under Lane 3, which is to think about the physical infrastructure of the street. One of the reasons we say Promenade 3.0 is that this year we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of the current incarnation of the street, which is actually the second version of the mall, as you'll recall. The Santa Monica Mall originated in 1965. The current version of the street, Promenade, opened in 1989. And so we're thinking, what's the third version now that we've hit the third decade of the current version? So that's kind of part of the terminology. But if you pay attention to the physical infrastructure of the street, you'll see that the infrastructure is looking a little worn. Light fixtures need replacing. There's a lot of cracks in the sidewalk. And some of the pavers, the sort of unique hexagonal pavers, are actually no longer available. When they crack and break, they have to be replaced with asphalt. And so that's actually what initiated the whole project, was to look at the physical infrastructure. So Lane 3 has really kind of driven the ship in a way in the timeline and the kind of process, thinking about the physical infrastructure. But there are 2 other very important lanes that we're working on as well. Lane 1 has to do with how we manage the public space. And this really ultimately has to do with issues of DTSM services agreement that defines what kind of events they can actually stage on the street without getting special kinds of event permits, what regulations they have to operate under. And it also has to do with just how the street is policed itself. It's currently considered a street like any other street in Santa Monica, so all the sort of First Amendment rights and the ability to stay there 24 hours a day, all that sort of applies on 3rd Street like it would on 22nd Street or Wilshire Boulevard. And so managing the public space is an issue that we're starting to explore, like are there other ways of thinking about what the street is? But as I said, that really has to do with kind of a management through DTSM and their arrangement with the city attorney's office and how we think about the street. Tonight we're going to talk about some components of Lane 2, which has to do with maximizing private property. And so there are a variety of different options under here that relate to tenanting and how the street's being tenanted, and are our regulations appropriately in tune with the kinds of tenants that would like to move onto the promenade, particularly given the kind of dynamic retail environment and entertainment environment that we're living in, where it's very hard to predict what the new trend is going to be in terms of retail. We always like to say, if we could tell you where retail is going to go in the next 10 years, we'd all be in a different line of work, making a lot more money, because we'd have our hands on crystal balls. So today's conversation is about some components of Lane 2. So that's why Rios is not here tonight. So the commission may remember that it was in June we approached you and asked you to open up the door on the zoning code for some of the Lane 2 topics. We had presented this matrix to you at that time. This is a matrix of issues or objectives that are listed on the left-hand side that fall under Lane 2, and the ones that are highlighted are ones that are actually have an analog or an issue related to the zoning code itself. The other topics that aren't highlighted are often more process-oriented and less about being in the code. It's more about how we manage issues. And so the other piece of this is also identifying, the kind of pink column identifies whether it's a process or it's a regulation. Most of the rows that are checked with regulations are also highlighted because they're code-related issues. Then there's long-term and short-term, and then we also identified whether DTSM would be the lead or whether the city really needed to be the lead. So you can kind of see graphically just how that breaks out. But we had worked on this matrix with DTSM over the early side of this year, and then that matrix became the basis for a resolution of intent to modify the zoning ordinance that the Planning Commission adopted in June of this year. And so these are the very specific zoning sections that you gave us the authority to open up and look into on the 19th of June. In June, we had originally thought that we'd come back to you with a full-fledged red lines at some point in the future and sort of adopt this as a kind of permanent code. Our thinking on this has shifted. We're now thinking that it probably makes sense to do this as an IZO or an interim zoning ordinance that could be adopted concurrent with the physical plan as that moves forward and comes in front of the council, hopefully sometime early 2020. We could test that out while the final engineering drawings for the physical plan and all the financing that needs to go with that is developed. That could take a 2-year time frame. And in that time frame, we could develop the permanent code language and sort of hyperventilate over the very specific red line language that we're going to adopt, and make sure it's totally in sync with the plan that's going to be potentially built. So the thinking there is just, it makes more sense to think about doing this as an IZO and sort of try it out for a year or two and sort of see how it plays out, and then adjust the code, final code language once we see how things are working. So that's why you're not seeing red line language tonight. So in my staff report, I said there was really kind of 2 major topics that these code intentions or these were trying to get at. The first was to expand evening activities, and then the second was to expand opportunities for creative leasing. So what I've done here in the presentation is I've taken, at the top you can see expand evening activities, and then I've highlighted the specific code sections that would apply to those particular topics. And so on this one, expand evening activities, if I can just go back, these 2 sections of the code that are highlighted here have to do with all the sort of regulations that apply to having a restaurant or use with alcohol permit or providing live entertainment. And what we find when we look at that is that there are about 26 separate rules that a restaurant needs to get if they don't want to have a CUP for alcohol service, and then if they want to provide entertainment, they also have another set of regulations on there. And when we look at what happens on the promenade today, of the restaurants that are on the promenade, there are some that adhere to this because these 26 rules were part of a relatively recent code amendment. So it's a kind of process that if you've really been applied for in the past 2 years, you can sort of plug in and utilize that. If you predate 2 or 3 years, you may have gone through a CUP process. You may have a different package of regulations or conditions on your use. And if you're really old and grandfathered in, you may have even less or kind of a different. And so there's kind of a discrepancy up and down the street in terms of how these how restaurants that have alcohol, the sort of CUP conditions that they operate under. So there's a kind of inherent kind of disconnect there, or kind of inconsistency on a street that probably wants to perform very consistently in this respect. And the idea is that our sort of thinking here is that if we could simplify the rules for alcohol exemption, everybody would just use those simplified rules as opposed to going to separate CUPs. And that would also sort of accelerate sort of the ability to have these uses. On the other hand, if you are a restaurant and you want to have some sort of entertainment use, there's another series of regulations you have to go through. The one that sort of stands out to us as being kind of strange is a restriction on the number of TV screens. You're only allowed to have 3 TV screens. Nobody can kind of understand necessarily why that is. Maybe it's a sort of a desire to sort of prohibit sports bars. But that's one of the restrictions. So one of the things we'd be interested in hearing is the Planning Commission sort of opinions and thoughts on some of these restrictions. You have a great deal of experience on these topics, and you may recall cases where there were particular conditions imposed, and it made good sense. And if that's the case, I'd certainly like to hear that. The goal of sort of enhancing or kind of allowing the nightlife to continue and alcohol exemptions, et cetera, is that what we know from surveys we've done on the promenade is that it's pedestrian traffic peaks at 3 p.m. and then just declines as the day goes on. And so there's this evening activity that's really being lost. So if we can encourage people to stay on the promenade into the evening for entertainment, restaurants that are already operating with alcohol, that may be advantageous to some of the goals we have for the street. So we'll move on to opportunities for creative leasing. One of the topics that we identified that we might want to consider amending is land use regulations. And this is a little bit at cross purposes to the previous discussion. And that is right now on the land use table, there is a restriction that prevents or makes it very difficult for existing restaurants to convert to retail on the promenade. So you have to go through a process if you want to do that. And so one possibility is that we simply remove that limitation and allow any existing restaurant space to convert to retail based on kind of market trends and demands, and property owners kind of read of the market. It's worth noting, and probably the Planning Commission, some of you may remember this better than I would, but there has been a long history of tinkering with these restrictions on the promenade. So it would seem that every 5 to 8 years, we're constantly tweaking caps on the number of restaurants we have, the restrictions on restaurants, whether they can convert to retail or not, always with a desire to try and maintain this kind of optimum balance of the number of restaurant spaces on the street versus retail. So I think at one point there was a concern that the street was trending too much towards retail, or too much towards dining, not enough retail, so the rules were changed to try and dial that back. And at least under the current version of the code, it would sort of imply that the balance is kind of appropriate. And you can see the numbers, about 27% of the street is dining establishments, and the other balance being retail or entertainment. So it's about a 1/3, 2/3 mixture. So if we were to remove the restriction on restaurant converting to retail, most likely any restaurant operations that are not viable may convert over to retail. From what we understand, property owners can get significantly more dollars per square foot for retail on the promenade right now, so we could potentially lose those restaurant establishments that we currently have. So as I said, this restriction or this particular change might be a little bit at cross purposes of trying encouraging restaurants to continue to serve alcohol and have evening entertainment, but it's a topic that has come up for discussion. The other two, these next two topics relate to the alleys, and I have some visuals and some data here to share on this. And this has consumed kind of the bulk of our sort of discussion in a way as we've sort of dived into this. And so there are two requirements, one related to waste management or refuse and recycling enclosures, and then the other related to loading docks. One of the goals that's been articulated in various meetings about Promenade 3.0 is a desire to activate the alleys, and by activate we mean sort of enhance their pedestrian appeal, make them part of a broader pedestrian network that includes the promenade, but also make the alleys part of that network. And I would say there's perhaps a bit of Pasadena envy when we talk about this. These are 3 images of old Pasadena. I'm sure you've all been there. The alleys are, as you can see, very attractive. They're tree lined. There's outdoor dining on the alleys, etc. And so I would say there's perhaps a desire to see the alleys flanking 3rd Street Promenade sort of take on this character. There is also a thought in this that we might want to see more alley-facing businesses. And so this is the West Side Comedy Theater that only fronts onto the alley. The front side, the alley, the promenade face of this building is a different tenant and a different use. And there are a couple of objectives here. One is more alley fronting businesses will activate the alleys from a pedestrian standpoint. There'll be reason to walk up and down the alley because there'll be businesses or theaters there. The other kind of desire on this, or sort of interest in this, is that what we're seeing with retail tenants is that whereas they may have taken the entire building, all 150-foot depth of it, the retail establishments, even businesses, even if they want to remain on the promenade, they're shrinking their footprint and the square footage they need. So a lot of the kind of A-class tenants that can pay promenade rents really only require about 3,000 to 5,000 square feet of space. And so the back 2/3 of a lot of these storefronts and buildings on the promenade are potentially sitting vacant. So we'd like to see uses front onto the alley that are maybe not paying the promenade rent. So you could have your comedy theaters, you could have the nightclubs, you could have even things that are serving local, kind of local population, like, shoe repair or dry cleaners, those kinds of activities that simply couldn't pay rents on the promenade. We think that those could have a place on the alleys, like this example here. And what we found, and this is a case where somebody did come in with property on the promenade with alley frontage, where they wanted to provide a lobby space fronting the alley for upstairs offices. And they've ended up not being able to pursue this scheme because of the requirements for trash recycling and loading docks that we have in the code. And so this is an example of a kind of proposition that was brought forward, but ultimately had to be dropped because the code literally was sort of in the way of this proposition. Happily, this building is finding a different sort of use in a different way, but it is a kind of relevant example. The part about this, and this is an analysis that the applicant prepared that's a little bit crazy from our perspective, is that we require a certain size of loading dock in the code that's scaled to the building square footage. But if you put that loading dock on the promenade on these smaller buildings with alley frontage, it's actually impossible to maneuver a standard size loading truck to sort of actually make the turning radiuses to get into that loading dock. And so this is 2 of 4 different studies this applicant showed that no matter how they sort of imagined your kind of standard shuttle van sort of backing up into this loading space, it would always hit the building somewhere. And so they actually can't use the loading dock the way it was designed to be done, when the van sort of backs into the building and gets out of the alley. So we're requiring a loading dock, but in many cases they're not being used to actually for the vans to back into. This is probably an example of one of the better behaved businesses on the street. This is the backside of the Apple store. And so you can see on the left, their loading dock, and on the right, their kind of trash enclosures. The size of these are both dictated by the code and other sort of regulations. You can see the loading dock on the left here is actually just kind of a stack of boxes. So what seems to be happening in a lot of cases of these loading docks is it becomes the sort of staging area as boxes and deliveries need to come and go through the buildings. So the vans aren't backing into them, but they are serving a purpose of sort of providing storage for incoming and outgoing boxes. And then this is a typical situation. This is literally just a few doors down from that Apple store, where what's happening here is the first truck is bringing in deliveries for food for one of the restaurants that's there. So that's the Hummus Express directly in front. And then the next truck beyond is FedEx. So that's the FedEx guy carrying a big box on his shoulders down the middle of the alley. Beyond that is a contractor doing work on the roof of a building fronting onto 4th Street, and he's got a ladder propped up there. This is the same alley condition viewed from Santa Monica Boulevard. So you can see another loading dock or another van parked there in the alley. And then coming out onto the streets, the Costco truck is parked on Santa Monica Boulevard, and you can see the Costco delivery guy with his pallet sort of wheeling things, jaywalking across Santa Monica Boulevard to bring into other businesses. So this is what is pretty typical kind of delivery conditions on the alleys today. And so these are 2 other examples also around the same time where you could see even the federal government is just parking their vans in the alley. So very few of these loading docks are actually being used for vehicles to pull in and get out of the alleys. Almost everybody's sort of parking in the alleys. Mobility staff did a survey of downtown businesses a while back, and of the 90-something businesses that responded to them, about 50 were located on the promenade. And so you'd see the promenade delivery, most of the deliveries to promenade businesses are being done off the alley, a few being done on the street. And then they also surveyed what time their deliveries were coming in versus going out, if they're doing deliveries going out. And again, most of these delivery trucks are showing up starting around 10 o'clock and going into 12 p.m. And one kind of obvious explanation for that is that a lot of the businesses are retail establishments. They don't open until 10, so there's nobody there to receive the packages until 10 o'clock. But then you can see there's a kind of a spike of deliveries going out around 4 o'clock. So this is the kind of rhythm of what's happening on the street relative, or in the alleys relative to deliveries in the loading docks. The other thing we asked our team to do, and this is a kind of snapshot of work we still need to ground truth a little bit, we've actually asked them to survey all the alleys and map out all the loading doors, the pedestrian entrances, utilities, trash enclosures. This is a little bit difficult to ascertain sometimes as you walk down the street. If a loading dock is closed or door is closed, you don't know if there's trash behind there or if it's a loading dock, but we thought it'd be pretty productive to actually understand what was happening up and down the alleys before we entertain any sort of changes to the regulations. So we're working on this is to be able to inform our work and our thinking on this. So relative to loading space requirements, there are a couple of different options here. With an IZO, one possibility is to simply eliminate the requirement that properties fronting the promenade provide a loading space, a loading dock, because most people seem to be using the street for their loading and they deliver into the back door. That's certainly a possibility, and we'll see what happens if properties take advantage of that in the time of the IZO. Another possibility is that we sort of adjust the loading space requirements, so maybe we're not trying to provide a loading space that is actually sized to park a vehicle in it, but they still have to provide a loading zone so that the boxes, et cetera, and pallets that are coming into businesses are not being stored on the alley, they're being stored in the building. But if that may need to be, that would be considerably less size in many cases, I think, than providing a space for a van. So again, the rationale of this is that many of the businesses simply aren't using their loading docks, and in many cases it's impossible to actually back a truck or a van into the loading docks that they have based on current requirements. Relative to the trash and recycling room requirements, this is also sort of provided out and kind of laid out in the code. We've been talking with the R3 staff that run the trash trucks and recycling trucks up and down the alleys and throughout the downtown and throughout the entire city. And one possibility is that we eliminate the code requirements, so we provide recycling and refuse rooms for buildings. But it turns out this may not be the simple solution. Obviously, buildings are still generating trash. Many of the buildings are utilizing the shared trash enclosures that are provided in the city parking structures, but not all of them are. So if you're utilizing a shared trash enclosure in one of the parking structures, you're charged a particular fee. It's a little bit difficult as a trash customer to be able to control how much you're getting charged when you're in a common facility. They kind of do a trash analysis and you're given a fee. If you have a trash enclosure on your property and you can enclose it behind a fence, you can control the cost of your trash because only you're the one putting trash into your trash enclosure, or into your trash bin. So there are some reasons why property owners or tenants may want to have trash on site. Recycling is another sort of issue, but we actually don't charge the same way for recycling as we do for trash. And then another issue that we've sort of discovered as we looked into this is the issue of compost waste. We need to have compost containers for the restaurants and potentially for other businesses as well, depending on how well we do at a state level with our kind of waste diversion goals. Oops. Getting ahead of myself here. So what we've kind of come to the conclusion as we've talked through this with the staff that manages the trash trucks is that we think actually the solution to sort of reducing the demand for recycling room requirements has to do more with focusing on the operations of the trash and recycling pickup rather than sort of amending it through the zoning code. The last topic to talk through here is under opportunities of creative leasing. Is one of the things we talked about was regulation of brewery and coffee roasting operations. Right now, we do permit if you are brewing beer, say, on site, and you're consuming it on site, like the brewery at the top of Santa Monica Place in the mall, that's permitted because you're essentially a restaurant or a tavern, and the brewing is an ancillary use to it. But one of the things that is occurring, or we're starting to see in other cities, is that these kinds of facilities are quite large, where it's pretty clear that they're shipping stuff off-site for off-site sales. So Starbucks Reserve, this is the mothership in Seattle. You can see that gigantic copper container. It's pretty hard to believe that all the coffee they roast in this particular store, they're selling at this store. They may be shipping it out to other stores. But I put Starbucks Reserve up here because it's this kind of apocryphal, notorious story that Starbucks Reserve wanted to move on the promenade and we're told they couldn't for some reason. It could be, although we don't think so, it could be because they thought the zoning code was in the way, but maybe because there were other issues at play. But another one is distilleries and breweries. This is an example in Long Beach, Portuguese Bend Distillery. They've got a nice little storefront operation and tavern. They're located near the downtown. And it's pretty apparent that they're shipping bottles off-site for off-site sales. At the very least, when I was there, they had a whole bunch of boxes and stuff sitting outside, so it looked like there was a delivery coming. So it seems that under the current understanding of the code, if you were doing that kind of activity, if you're producing something on site, selling it on site, but also shipping it off site, you start drifting into territory where you're considered limited industry, and therefore you're not permitted on the promenade. So one of the thoughts has been that perhaps we could allow limited industry on promenade properties with some limitations. So one thought is that it could be restricted to the back 2/3 of promenade properties, so it's not impacting the front third where you're facing the street and the storefront. Another possibility, and I'm not sure our zoning staff would support this, is to develop a whole new package of definitions and requirements for the desired industries that we would permit on promenade properties. Because when you look at the definition of limited industry, it includes a variety of activities that maybe we don't want to see on the promenade, including monument making, which I assume is tombstones. Our thought on the project team has been, if you want to carve tombstones on the promenade and you can pay the rent, and you want to sell them out front, I guess, it could be kind of an interesting thing. But the scenario that I like to think of as an alternative to breweries or coffee roasters would be somebody making surfboards. That's we're a beachside city, and we've been talking a lot in the Promenade project about sort of reflecting that. It'd be really interesting if somebody was making surfboards on the backside of the property and then selling them or displaying them on the storefronts that face the promenade proper. So I think that's where we're going to end. Quick whirlwind tour on this. As I said, what we're trying to develop is to sort of figure out what we want to say in an IZO that would go forward to concurrent with the vision plan that we think would be in front of City Council in early 2020. So we're interested in the Commission's sort of thoughts and experiences on some of these topics and issues you'd like us to explore. And then I think we'd probably propose that we'd come back to you with where we've ended up with the IZO before we deliver that as City Council. So with that,
Thank you.
finished.
Thank you. We have actually one chit, but that chit is Kathleen Ralston. And Stephen you've donated your time to Kathleen, right? Okay. Thank you, Alan. You'll be back for questions,
Okay.
I'm sure. Mm-hmm.
Good evening, Commissioners. Very happy to be here. This is long overdue look at the promenade, and we're very happy for your support up to this time. Alan did a great job of giving you the entire background. I also want to acknowledge Stephen Welliver and Andrea Korb from my staff who have been working very hard on this. Everybody's working together, which is wonderful. So as you know, there's no one solution for this change in retail, change in people's tastes. So the 3 lanes of 3.0 are meant to address those things. Because there's been time and time again in our meetings in downtown, it's just like if you just fix the traffic problem, everything would be fine, right? Well, we understand that certainly isn't the case. So so the 3 lanes are very important. They're working together. Lane 1, as Alan pointed out, really has to do with what can downtown Santa Monica do to enliven the public space. What kind of community events, concerts, interesting things can we do to help make the downtown a very complete experience. The 4 main points that Alan pointed out that you're going to talk about tonight, just want to give just a little bit more color. You've been supportive on the CUP, standardized CUP in the past. We're very grateful for that. Re-looking at it and allowing a broader and potentially more flexible list of CUP requirements will do a few things. First of all, it adds a lot of predictability to the process. It also enables more independent businesses to give it a go on the promenade. There's a big risk. There's a lot of rent to pay, and adding that flexibility with how they can serve will help substantially. On the retail restaurant conversion, this one is, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So right now we have a moratorium that prohibits a conversion from a restaurant to a retail on the promenade. We've had a proliferation of eating establishments throughout the downtown, as you saw in that wonderful timeline. The thing that we were most concerned about when we talked about this was the loss of outdoor dining, because outdoor dining really is activity on the public right-of-way. I don't think any of us, oh, that was magic. Thank you. I don't think any of us want to lose outdoor dining. So it either has to be in front of the businesses or it has to be in the public right-of-way. So the 3.0 that you'll see at some point in the future, the actual plan for the public streetscape, does include a lot of seating. It includes some eating establishments on the street itself. So if we maintain that, or if we establish that, there may be less need to have the outdoor dining immediately adjacent to the buildings. But again, would love to hear your thoughts on that issue. There is concern that the tide has turned to restaurants, and so they are really cannibalizing. That's a terrible word to use, but they're not surviving at the rate that we'd like to see them, just because of the massive competition. The loading zones and waste management, I'm so excited about this. We need to think about this from a broad perspective. No one uses their loading zone. I will tell you, I'm in the downtown every single day. They all offload in the alley. We may, if we eliminate loading zones, we may want to consider some time restrictions on loading in the downtown, but on weekends potentially, but we don't need the loading zones. Trash, as Alan said, is a little bit more complicated, but being able to use those rear facades to both access wonderful, interesting, either neighborhood serving or interest, is that the 6 minutes already, Kyle?
Kyle, she got 6 minutes.
Oh, I only got 4 total? Oh, I didn't talk fast enough. All right, we'll have a couple more points, but that's the...
Well,
I have a question.
there are questions the commissioner has of you, so you can continue.
Okay.
Commissioner Landers.
My first question is, what are your couple more points?
Okay, I'll try and be succinct. Thank you. Having more activated uses in the alley adds a level of social surveillance that I just want to point out. Okay, so we all know of our social issues all across the country, and we experience it in downtown as well. More eyes and ears on those alleyways will be very helpful. And then on the manufacturing piece, I'm excited to think about this. The idea again that the back third or half of the building could be used for makers making interesting things, again gives entrepreneurs maybe another option to lease on the promenade. So in order to establish some interesting tenancy, not just the same old, I think that there will be a lot to be gained by your review of these amendments tonight.
So thank you. So I actually have a follow-up on that.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. So what we see in the PowerPoint is looking at the rear 2/3 and looking at ground floor spaces. I'm actually curious about what you think about the upper story spaces. Why would we restrict it to, why would we limit it to ground floor, and why would we limit it to the rear 2/3, given that some of those industries actually have some pretty interesting visuals when you think about what might be possible. I mean, to see somebody sanding a surfboard in a window if we want to, or I'm thinking of places like Szentendre in Hungary, where you can see people actually making linens or preparing strudel, multi-layered strudels that would be potentially be shipping off-site, right? So we're not talking about a purely restaurant use, but does provide some visual engagement, some street conversation. Is that part of the vision, or is there a reason that you would want some of it or not?
Well, I think experiential retail is very much part of what we're experiencing.
Right.
Today.
Experiencing, yes.
So watching people make things or do things is very much part of what people are doing. I don't think we'll have a restriction on second floor. I think it was an example.
Okay.
That,
I'm curious because I've
Okay.
seen a coffee roaster in Slovakia that actually ran it was inside a mall, and on the second floor, never smelled a thing. So I was curious whether there was some some concern related to second
Yeah.
story.
What's wrong with smelling it?
It would have been great, but I could imagine other people objecting to having some sort of industry that would create sounds or smells or other
Okay,
things.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Is that it?
That's it. Thank you.
Commissioner Pastor.
Hi.
Hi.
Couple questions. Do you support the IZO approach to this?
Yes, I think together we've decided, and there's people who can speak about this with much more accuracy than I can, but it gives us more flexibility and also gives us a longer time frame. So is that correct? So the IZO can actually last up to 5 years, where the other were shorter.
And do you get, in terms of the restaurant conversion issue, are you getting a lot more requests for restaurants that people want to come in but don't want to go through the process, or just trying to understand what the demand is?
Well, it is interesting. The Promenade has vacancies, more vacancies than we want. So part of the thinking around removing the restriction is that you just let more opportunities come in. What has been kind of interesting is that you may have seen that a CUP application. There's an opportunity for large format restaurants right now to convert a portion of their square footage to retail. What we've seen is the CUP application was filed, but then withdrawn because they found a restaurant tenant to take the entire space. So we have 2 new large-scale restaurants scheduled to open on the Promenade. So the restaurants are not going to go away immediately, and maybe with the 5-year time span, we would be able to start seeing a pattern with enough advance warning to see if it might be a problem. So we're not seeing restaurants go away, and we're not getting property owners banging down our doors saying, take down the restriction because I want to rent to retail, because the retail spaces are vacant as well.
Understand is let's say I'm a landlord. I have a restaurant tenant.
Yes.
The restaurant tenant wants to go away. I now have a vacant storefront.
Yes.
At what point the only way that restaurant can now become something else is a CUP, no matter how long it's vacant?
Yes.
Years and years.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Fresco.
Sorry, this restaurant thing is still bending my brain. So the numbers I saw on the screen, I thought said that 1/3 of the businesses on the Promenade are restaurants and half the businesses in the rest of downtown are restaurants. I thought I saw that.
Let's get that.
And
Andrea's
so
beautiful
I'm
chart up.
trying to understand if there's a lot of vacant retail and there's fewer restaurant spaces, it's annoying for the individual landlords maybe who just want to be able to do whatever they want, but does it really matter that much? Aren't there enough vacant other spaces that retail can go in? And wouldn't it be kind of a boost to a small upstart restaurant to move into a facility that was already infrastructured to be a restaurant?
Second
That
question.
was 2 questions.
Yeah,
I
second
have.
question first, absolutely. A restaurant is going to want to go in where there's already a hood and
Right.
infrastructure.
So that seems like it's good for us.
So, but what I would say is that remember that the buildings along the Promenade are owned by families who, most of them have owned them for generations.
Right.
Okay? So, unlike a private shopping mall, you can't say you want a restaurant here and that'll be a lost leader, right? And we'll put high revenue retail in this location and it will balance out. These property owners are mostly small business people, and they really need, at this point in the retail world, we really need, I believe, to give them as much flexibility as possible to fill those vacancies. I think once we're full, or once we're close to full, then it's easier to have that conversation. But right now, it is important to just get the lights on.
So this might be a provision that might be more of an IZO within an IZO, more of it's really the most experimental thing. Maybe just we only need it temporarily to boost things as opposed to a test to see how it goes for the future.
It takes several years to open something normally, so I would caution us to not take too small of a window as a test period, but we will quickly see if there's a trend because there are current vacancies. So we'll see. There's I think one small restaurant required space left on the promenade that's vacant, but the larger ones are already tenanted, and they're tenanted with long term.
So, okay, I get all that. So then my other question is the other thing that you brought up that is something we might want to think about was the outdoor dining.
Yes.
And that if these restaurants stop being restaurants, then the outdoor dining is gone forever. But if we provide seating on the promenade, that might not be an issue. But it might be an issue for restaurants from their point of view, as opposed to...
Well, they can still have the outdoor dining. So if there is a restaurant on the promenade, whether it's regulated to be a restaurant or not, they're still permitted to have outdoor dining. We're not suggesting that outdoor dining goes away with independent
So new
restaurants.
restaurants, if they show up in new places, they can also get outdoor dining.
That's correct. I'm
Okay.
sorry if I was unclear.
Yeah, I do. Okay. I have other questions, but I'll let other people go.
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
There's a lot of history in this big blue arrow here.
I know, it's a good slide, isn't it?
But first of all, what's remarkably stable is the number of dining establishment. It just flatlines. Does that reflect a lot of tugging of pulling it up and pushing it down over, 2 decades?
It does.
Or
And
does
we-
that reflect really market forces that were unfettered? There was no one tugging up or pushing down.
Well, there was tugging because
Okay.
we had alcohol limitations on the number of alcohol outlets per block for several years. We had the cap on the number of restaurants. We used to have a cap on 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Remember that, David? That was a long time ago. We have a limitation on fast food establishments. We have a limitation on the number of food courts because over the years we've had a threat of or a proliferation of many things. So over the years, there have been many ordinances, some emergency ordinances that have helped really regulate
Okay.
the uses on the street.
So my question is, now we seem to be entering uncharted territory where no one knows nothing of what's going to happen. And so what we're really being invited to do is take the controls off and let the experiment run. Would that be accurate portrayal of what's going to happen here?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be the wild, wild west in terms of taking the controls off, but it certainly will loosen the reins to allow, hopefully, for some more interesting and viable uses on the street.
Right. But right now you've suggested that restaurants are eating each other's lunch. In other words, they've reached some sort of maximum capacity that could only go up if there was more attendance on the promenade. Is that
Yeah, so
clear?
just to point out at the chart, attendance would make a big difference, but there's 59 establishments in 2004 in the district-wide, right? Now there's 209.
Oh, so the district is clobbering the promenade,
So
is
the
what you're saying.
district, right, so if you look at the whole district, there's many, many, many choices of fabulous food in downtown Santa
Right.
Monica.
But we only have control over the dining establishments on the promenade. Everybody else is doing their own thing with their own landlord. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. The only limitation right now, is that right? Yeah. The only limitation right now is on the promenade of conversion from restaurant to
I see.
retail.
Okay. So that was one question. I'm glad you clarified that. The second question is, how does Pasadena handle this tension between the alley loading and the active use of the alleys that would be so to speak, taken away from the trucks? How do they manage this?
Well, Alan, do you have actual experience? Because here's what I will say. I was just in Paris, and bikes and trucks and pedestrians and cars all manage to get
In
around.
a 20-foot wide.
Precisely. You know, at some point we have to stop delineating life.
Okay.
But other than that.
Yeah, on the Pasadena issue, we can dig into that and find out exactly how they manage that. I would say, from experience there, a lot of the alleys have bollards, so they're time restricted, and it's not just a sign up there that everybody ignores, but there's actually bollards or gates that come up that prevents the loading trucks from coming into the alley when they want to close it off. A lot of their alleys, as you saw in the picture, are actually significantly wider than the alleys that we have, so they have a lot of opportunity for that back of house activity. So I think that's another issue. And then in some cases, the alleys that, you know, if you do as I did for this presentation, do a Google image search on old Pasadena alleys, a lot of the photos that come up are actually on private properties. So One Colorado, which is where they do KCRW has concerts there, it's where Crate and Barrel, Il Fornaio is. All those alleys is all one ownership. That's a mall, one ownership. And so they handle their deliveries, you know, kind of on one of the side streets. But we certainly dig into and find out how Pasadena is regulating their alleys and what experience they've had there. I will say one of the things that came up in conversation with our colleagues who manage our trash trucks, they would love to start early in the morning, you know, as early as 5 in the morning to pick up trash in downtown because they could get in and out before all the traffic shows up. But they don't start until roughly 7 or 8 o'clock. They sort of recognize the same hours that we impose on construction crews. And that's in large measure because of the noise their trucks generate. And then they get complaints from neighbors, you know, people who live downtown and people who are in the hotels. Because every time one of those trash truck comes in to get one of those bins you saw, they wheel the bin in and it drives in with the forks, lifts it up, drops it down, then the truck backs up and the beeper goes off. So every time they pick up one of those bins, the beepers are going. And so that generates all sorts of complaints for them. So they don't really start until 7 or 8 o'clock, although they would love to start earlier if they could.
Okay.
So I think Pasadena handles all that by having all this stuff done early in the morning.
But that would suggest they have either quieter trash trucks or fewer people living nearby to complain, it seems like.
It's not an option.
Well,
Well, all Pasadena has had a proliferation of residential development in the past 10 years, so they may be starting to see complaints. But we can dig into it and find out.
and last question, is there any difference between the alleys on the east side of the promenade versus alleys on the west side?
In what terms?
Well, do they function exactly the same? Is there a different mix of trash, loading docks, businesses all facing onto them?
Sure,
Are they interchangeable, or is there a bias where we could optimize for some things in one alley and optimize for other things in another alley? Say?
They function largely the same. They have the same kind of package of issues going on. And both alleys have the 3 parking structures with some common trash enclosures. What we were looking into, one of the things we did we were kind of wanting to sort of document with this survey map that I put up, is where there's actually driveways that go into private businesses. So we were actually kind of interested to see whether you could close alleys altogether at certain hours. And it looks like there might be some opportunities for that, but there are also some locations where the alleys can be closed to general vehicle traffic at all because some private office building or residence, that's their only access to their parking supply, you know, their driveway comes off the alley.
Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to put a footnote on the housing issue on alleys. As we probably all know, there's an RFP out now for it. I could never remember the number of the parking structure. 3. To do a substantial housing project on the alley. So we will be looking at that whenever we do.
Yeah, and we've requested that they include in their RFP an expectation they do a fairly large trash enclosure for the benefit of the 3rd Street promenade properties on that block.
It'd also be nice to have some exposure of the project itself onto the alley. I don't know exactly how that would, like a lobby or what, I don't know what. Yeah.
Yeah, but it will raise the issue that there's a big trash enclosure under an apartment
Yeah.
building, and
Yeah.
there's the beeping and all the noise that we just discussed.
Thanks very much. Are there other commission questions of staff?
Yes.
Commissioner Pastor.
One other question about the changes for live entertainment and for the regulations and alcohol permitting. Is that only for the promenade, or is that citywide? Just
Well-
because we heard something about Pico and live entertainment, so I just wanna
Correct, yeah.
clarify.
The resolution of intent that the commission adopted in June was specific to the BC district, which is just the promenade. I believe the way the regulations are written, they would actually currently apply citywide, so if we were gonna make some amendments, we'd have to figure out how to isolate those just to the promenade fronting properties. But the intent of the IZO is that it only applies to properties that front the promenade.
Commissioner Landers.
So, just to follow up on that point, actually, and this is a question of how the definitions work out. It's, do you see a way, both on the CUP, the alcohol CUP rules, and on the entertainment rules, to go a level up in terms of how we define certain uses, such that we could then create subcategories that would say apply to the promenade or to the or to Pico. I'm asking because what we heard in the Pico conversation was that they too were constrained by high level definitions that were applicable citywide, even if we want, and we don't have the sort of subcategories needed to be able to break it out for Pico. And it sounds like you have a similar limitation. So could we solve by going up a step and then breaking it out?
I'm trying to think through what that means to go up a step. I will say,
Going meta.
yeah.
I don't think we want to bring Pico into this. Is that what you're intending to do?
No,
a
I'm
global
not-
thing that would
I'm-
apply to Pico?
What?
Oh,
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do here is keep the focus on the promenade.
Right.
I think that what we do on the promenade and kind of what we learn from that could certainly inform us in terms of how we would address the issue on Pico or other parts of the city. But for this discussion and certainly this IZO, the idea is to keep it really focused on the promenade, see how it works, and then again use that to inform us on other issues.
So let me rephrase my question.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to avoid is, if changing something for the promenade requires changing a citywide definition, let's not change that definition twice.
Well, and
Right.
that's-
Let's change it once
Yeah.
and then be able to do what we want to do in different
but
places.
that's actually why we as a group decided it was best to do an IZO.
Okay.
Because at this point we're not changing the code. The
Got
code
it.
will stay exactly the same, but the IZO will say that in the BC district or whatever the promenade itself is, these things are allowed. Or these.
So notwithstanding definition
Exactly.
X, we can do whatever we want. Okay.
Exactly.
Got it.
Okay, Commissioner McKinnon.
Yeah, so you kind of raise a few issues, but it really comes back to the way we think about the city and the downtown. And we changed the definition of the downtown a couple of years ago to encompass from Wilshire down to the freeway. And it really all comes back to the fact that downtown, which we wrote a special community plan for, is a different part of the city. And if you live in that part of the city, you have to accept there'll be higher noise issues, just as if you live in the downtown of New York or King's Cross. And there'll be other sorts of things that happen in that downtown. And one of them might be that we have live entertainment and restaurants, that we change the definition so there's dancing in restaurants. I mean, this has been a bugbear of ours for what, 25 years. I'd also like to put forward that in some of the cities we're now looking at small bars by definition that could be no more than, say, 1,200 or 1,500 feet, that could fit an alley, and that require lesser licensing to get from start to fruition. And that, when you look at alleys, your people at Gell were very successful in Melbourne in reinvigorating those alleys. And if we look at places like some of the other commissioners are aware of, Prague or Barcelona, or almost all the places that have got very small old cities, they very successfully have invigorated all those laneways and alleys and still get deliveries. And so it's about maintaining the flexibility in there, but also encouraging new ways of thinking. So my question to you really is about Are we prepared to drive some significant changes in the way we handle the CUPs, for example, making the director the beginning and end of the CUP process, perhaps with appeal to the Planning Commission? That would change things. Are we prepared to put in a definition of small bars in that area alone that would encourage a different way of drinking? Are we prepared to take off kind of the provisions against dancing, which in essence means nightclubs? Are we prepared to look at live music being almost automatically part of some of the restaurants? Is that where you're going? Well, no, but I mean, a nightclub is a different deal to someone who provides, I don't know, a Caribbean steel band one night and, I don't know, gypsy music the next night.
Well, I would say from the standpoint of the project team working on Promenade 3.0, the answer is yes. The short answer would be yes.
So is that what you're going to bring back to us? A package that runs along those lines that significantly changes the way we handle
at
CUPs
least under the
and
context
approvals?
of an IZO, we could bring that forward if that's kind of if the commission would like us to explore that. But from the context of the Promenade 3.0 project, there's definitely been a desire to sort of increase the nightlife activity on the street. As I said, the pedestrian volumes sort of peak at 3 p.m. and go down, and sort of keep more people on the street into the evening. And there's been a pretty consistent in various stakeholder meetings desire to see there be those kinds of entertainment options. People wax nostalgic about this jazz club or that particular club they went to on their first date.
There also
years
seems
ago.
to be a problem in that we designed a wonderful esplanade, and so people are walking straight down the street to the pier, whereas they used to turn up 4th Street. So we've got an issue where absolute numbers to the promenade peaked, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and we've had a million people over the totality of the year fall away. We've now quadrupled the number of restaurants in the rest of the city, and people aren't making the turn up 4th Street or through Mesa Richards Mall or up 2nd Street. What's our plan on that?
In terms of trying to bring pedestrians off.
How do we get people to stop walking along the esplanade and break up into the promenade?
Well, we're interested in exploring some ideas for that, but there's obviously outside the context of an IZO.
It's a different lane, of course.
It's a different
It's lane
yes.
4 probably.
Yeah, it's
yeah.
I think one of the kind of goals that's articulated in the project vision and goals talks about the promenade not being a sort of singular space, but living in the context of a kind of pedestrian-oriented network that includes the alleys, the topic of kind of discussion tonight, but also the other network of pedestrian spaces like the Esplanade, like Mace Ridge, out to the beach, the pier, and trying to really integrate that as best we can within that overall network so people understand that integration.
Okay. Thanks. I'll
Commissioner
save comments.
Thanks. By the way, I want to thank you for the task force meeting ahead of this meeting tonight that we were able to attend and hear the updates. So that was very helpful, and I just want to acknowledge that as well. I'm having this instinct is to just sort of say yes, go for it, but I guess I have questions about your thinking that would be helpful to lead to the discussion, and two of them are. For instance, when we are looking at these delivery times to the businesses, you mentioned, for example, the notion of encouraging local residents serving businesses like dry cleaners or tailors or shoe repair, whatever it is. If that's the case, then the times that people would use those businesses typically would be at the evening, the morning, or on their lunch breaks. And the highest volume of delivery truck traffic is during the lunch break. So are you envisioning, for example, time of delivery restrictions that would create those separation windows?
That could be an option that we could explore with Public Works. Enforcement will be the issue if we don't have gates coming down on the alleys.
Right.
Because delivery trucks are doing what they're doing. In many cases, they're parked illegally or double parked as it is today. So that's just how this.
And are you looking at things like, you mentioned the notion that a private business might, need 24/7 access to its own property, but couldn't that be resolved with a key card? Even if the bollards were up for everybody else, they could. Yeah. Are you looking at? I guess my question is, I could suggest 5,000 things here, but I don't want to.
Please don't.
I don't want to go down a road without understanding the parameters of the kinds of what constraints you're considering for
Well,
these.
I would say the constraints when we talk about eventual capital project that and does some sort of substantive remake to the promenade, there could be a literally parallel capital project that addresses the alleys, and that goes with
Okay.
that. But that project being, minimum 2, probably more like 3 or 4 years down the road before it could actually implement, there's this interim time period in which an IZO could operate, where we couldn't say we're going to restrict all access to the alleys with bollards because they wouldn't be installed.
Okay.
But in the long term, those are things we could explore.
Potentially. The last two areas on the restaurants, with the CUP for the conversions, have you looked at size as a sort of permitting it below a certain size, restricting it above a certain, keeping the CUP above a certain size? Is it, again,
We could look at that. There is a language right now in the code that sort of has a size restriction, so we could sort of examine ways of tinkering that, dialing it up or dialing it down.
right, to the extent
So-
that there are businesses interested in small retail spaces, making that a little bit easier,
Right.
but
And I-
keeping it for the
And
larger.
I would say one of the things we could probably bring back as we sort of explore that is actually map the 22 restaurants that are on the promenade and figure out what their size is today.
Okay.
So
And-
there's very precise numbers. It's at 3 blocks, we can know pretty much every particular business and building on that street pretty well.
And then lastly, you had said in your presentation that you didn't think staff wanted, you thought it was a bit much to completely reinvent the limited industry definition. But do you have distinctions in mind of sort of good limited industry, bad limited industry?
Yeah, we looked at the definition of limited industry and kind of did a strikeout. We said that would be okay on the promenade, that one probably not. So there could be a way of addressing that with kind of a footnote in the land use table. That says-
Can I just insert, are you going to come back to us before the IZO goes to council?
At the moment, that would be my intention. Is we
Okay,
bring
so
back the
a lot of
IZO so you
the
can
fine
kind of
details and the
diagnose
redlining and what have you, we're not going to get into that tonight.
Right.
So-
No, that's why I'm asking, because I don't think, I think from where I sit, this is, my response to all of this is yes, go. But
Right.
I'm not sure what response I want to be helpful, and I'm not sure what response you're looking for, so I'm asking for more information in order to.
I think that's what he wants to
Yeah,
hear,
that's-
yes, go or don't go.
Okay.
Well, and also
Great.
what information you think we need to be bringing to the table to be able to
Commissioner
make informed
Reese.
decisions. So it's a helpful conversation so far.
Okay.
Hi, just a couple of maybe statement and then question. Well, not statement, but it seems to me that if our focus is trying to energize the promenade itself, we've seen one big issue with the arrow chart, which is the proliferation of restaurants throughout the downtown district. Is this looking at any way of trying to put uses back, maybe limit what's in the other streets and push it back towards the promenade?
No.
Okay.
Would be the short
And-
answer.
And because it seems to me that that's a big problem, and that we really want to activate the promenade. I mean, if that's really the goal, then having them expand all these other uses around is not all that helpful to that end goal. With the same, and I don't think that we can rely on retail as the savior, because everything that I see is that retail storefronts are hurting more and more, and I think we've heard that from Kathleen, that nobody's banging down the door saying we need more retail space. So while I'm supportive of the idea of allowing for restaurants to convert to retail, I just don't see that as a real huge concern that that's gonna happen. We'd be so lucky. Then I also wonder, and I'm all for people maximizing the use of their buildings, but putting the retail space in the alleys is, if we carve up areas for retail to go in the alleys, again, we're taking it away from the promenade, and that's really where the focus is. So I'm just curious if you have, any concerns that things that are outside of the promenade are really hurting us, and that's where we need to address our efforts.
Well, as a kind of general statement, I would say the promenade in a way is kind of the victim of its own success, and that 20 years ago, downtown was the promenade. There was all this effort to try and take the energy of the promenade and push it out to 2nd and 4th Street, et cetera. We've been very good at doing that to the point where now there's proliferation of riches throughout the downtown, and perhaps the promenade is sort of
Suffering
suffering
because of
in
it.
a
So
way.
maybe it's time to rein in some of those
Yeah.
uses to a degree.
Yeah, but
Or at least
that-
that's, those are just thoughts going on in my head. I'm all for trying whatever we can to activate the downtown. I do have a little concern, as Commissioner Fondabardi brought up, about the interplay of pedestrians in the alley, but I am reminded of many places where I've traveled where there's small cities or small streets where trucks are only allowed in there early in the morning, like up to 12, which seems to work with your time gauge. So I think we can get past that, but I'm also interested to hear what Pasadena does to manage the.
Okay, we'll come back with that. I mean, one piece that I didn't articulate, and it's sort of implicit, is that if we allow kind of manufacturing uses on the alley side, there are going to be trucks coming in to take goods out, which may be at cross purposes with trying to activate the alleys. But unless you accept that we can live in a world where cars and trucks and pedestrians can coexist happily, but
Yeah.
I can live in that.
At,
live in that
at
world.
such low speeds, I think that
Yeah.
that's doable.
I just, are you finished, Jim? Sort of a clarification point. I'm sorry, Nina. When we're talking about retail in the alley, my impression from all that we've been doing here is we're talking about a smaller retail and one that can't afford the promenade. So it could be a dry cleaner
That's
or a
correct.
shoe repair or, dog biscuit store, something. So it's not going to be competing with the promenade. It's a different kind of retail and probably a more neighborhood serving retail on the alley. Is that correct? Correct. Okay, thank you. Yes, right.
well, and it could even be retail that can't afford Second or Santa Monica,
Yeah.
some of the other streets in the downtown, because those rents are. pretty
I
high
mean,
as well.
hopefully it could be like small, locally owned businesses that we need more of.
Arrow Hobbies.
Commissioner Fresco, are we still at the point of questioning Alan? Or
I
are
think
we?
we're in discussion.
I think.
We're kind of morphing into discussion,
Okay,
but
let's
it's kind
let's
of
let
fun
Alan
to
sit
have
down
Alan.
and.
I like
I'm
having
happy to
Alan.
stand
Yeah,
here
you're-
and help you with this discussion.
He's a very cool guy, so I mean,
I think you kind of look like Abbott Kinney today, too.
Oh, Nita, I'm not sure if that's a compliment, but you're more successful than Abbott
I'm going
Kinney.
to take it as a compliment. So.
I just wanted to say, I don't actually agree with what Jim was saying about the rest of downtown sucking energy or
Are
life.
we at questions or just? This
Yes, I'm
Discussion.
getting there.
discussion? I think. Okay.
When we started our committee meetings and that whole big mishigas about what authenticity means came up, I kind of think that the reason the rest of downtown is having so much success is it sort of found itself, its authentic zone, and it's in a zone, and I don't think we should touch it. And my question is, what are we doing in all of this? After our last meeting, we saw a lot of really exciting ideas and, all that kind of stuff. But I started to wonder where we went with that. And is that like a really important ingredient that we're kind of losing in our effort to bring back the life of the promenade? I mean, I think that removing a lot of these regulations will help us find whatever that is, and I think that's a great idea to stop trying to mete out different proportions. But how are we making sure that it's authentic Santa Monica and that Santa Monica will recognize it as our promenade that we're sharing with the world? Where are we with that?
Well, I think what our thinking on these potential regulations or lifting some of these regulations is that it will make it potentially easier for businesses to occupy promenade spaces or even the alley sides of promenade buildings. And that if there's more flexibility in how people can tenant those spaces, perhaps that brings in a different package of tenants that currently aren't considering the promenade. Whereas, and Kathleen and her team could speak to this more than I could, but I think at this point where the rents are for promenade buildings, like the expectation, what the expectation is for rents really can only be met by kind of, national, international sort of chain credit retailers. So it's the T-Mobile store is the one that's given up as an example. They actually don't make enough money out of that building to cover their rent, apparently. they really view it as a marketing, and you can see that the building is designed as a billboard essentially. And I think that's been one of those examples that comes up time and again when we talk about authenticity in the street, that's not authentic. That's a billboard for T-Mobile, but that's where the rents are on the promenade. So part of that could be is the process that takes a considerable amount of time and CUPs, et cetera. That may be a contributing factor, but we think there's also something about just the scale of the spaces at this point in time being too big. So that's a lot of this is trying to figure out options that people can creatively subdivide their buildings.
And then that might be able to open the door for more organic kinds of choices
Yeah, or
to be made
simply-
by the market. Okay.
And retailers that are just smaller in footprint and perhaps therefore not national chains.
So then I wanted to ask you about these industrial uses, which I think sound really super cool. What are the kinds of things that you wouldn't want? What's wrong with a monument maker if it's somebody who's making the monuments?
Or Commissioner Fresco's favourite, flying cars, which we used to have.
Yeah, right, we've been
Or
there.
flying cars,
Yeah.
or people making clothes.
Bring back the
You
flying
know,
cars, I
remember
say.
Flap Happy?
Sure. Well, part of the definition also includes commercial laundries and dry cleaning plants. So
There's
somebody's-
also an economic feasibility issue, I think, too.
Yeah.
I think, like, flying cars are not going to make it on the promenade.
Well, we've learned flying cars will never make it.
But there was also a sort of thought when we sort of looked at this is that even if we allowed limited industry on the promenade under all the definitions, the rents of promenade buildings may sort of preclude
So it
commercial
might
dry
be
cleaners may just it may be sort of self-regulating.
self-selecting, so we don't have to worry too much
No.
about
But
it.
there may be some of these issues where it's like the commercial dry cleaner could just generate such a noxious sort of
Odor.
odor, or kind of the delivery issue becomes so kind of complex that we just wouldn't want to deal with that.
Okay.
Okay. Commissioner McKinnon?
So I think I'd like to move to start discussion.
I would
Commissioner-
too.
Commissioner Pastor, did you have to go? Did you want to speak first?
You
or-
just can't leave.
No.
Well, you're riveted now. Okay.
No, I'm gonna leave in about 6 minutes.
Okay. Commissioner Reese?
So the other concept was doing something with the CUPs, maybe scaling back some of the conditions. I'm curious. I mean, I thought that was a pretty novel way of going about it, where it said, if you can live with these conditions, don't go through the CUP process. Saves a lot of money, hurts the entitlement business a little bit, but some of us can survive. So my question is, since we've implemented that, how many people have chose not to go with the standard conditions and have filed a standalone CUP? My assumption is it's going to be slim
All
to,
but one.
it'll be very few.
And, yeah, Kathleen.
Right. So, I mean, I
Casa
think
Martin for entertainment.
that to me really shows that it works quite well. And I don't know that we need to scale back any of those conditions unless you can bring to us the next time that, this one condition is really problematic. Is it the one that says 35% of all of your, only 35% can be through alcohol, or 35% of your gross sales can be through alcohol, or something like that? We used to struggle with that a lot. I don't know if it's still there, but if there's something like that, then bring it back. But it seems to me that's working pretty well right now.
Okay. We'll
The
bring
TV
something back.
screens may be an issue.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine,
Yeah.
and that
Entertainment.
doesn't make a lot of
Well,
sense.
and one of the other ones was how long you can serve alcohol, but without the kitchen being open. So you're a restaurant that already serves alcohol, or you have a bar, you shut the kitchen down at 10, but you continue to operate as a bar until midnight or 1 or 2 a.m.
And
Is
that'd
that
probably
okay?
get close to the whole concept of it's a nightclub at this point, and if we're going to allow that, then we would want to rein that in or
Yeah.
change that. So I guess I'd be interested in seeing which of those are really problematic at this point.
Okay, we'll do a little more research on who's operating and what's
Okay.
been going on.
Thank you so very much for your
Thank you.
patience and your ability to stand as long as you have.
I was on a plane for 6 hours yesterday, so it feels good.
Well, then standing probably feels good. I agree with Commissioner McKinnon. I think we're ready for discussion. What I would propose is that we not get into the weeds, that we not try to design a red line version tonight, but that we just go through the major issues that Alan and DTSM have raised, and express ourselves to the extent we haven't already expressed ourselves. And that gives the direction I think staff needs to proceed with the red line. So can we do that?
Okay, I'm good to go.
Who wants to go first?
Well, I'm sitting here waiting. Okay.
What? Commissioner Pastor can go first because she's leaving.
I'll be very quick.
Oh,
I
I'm leaving too, actually.
support the discussion that we've had tonight. I think you should just go. Let's see what you come back with. I'd love to see a bunch more stuff about industry. I'd love to see more flexibility. I'd love to see the ability for smaller businesses to easily locate.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you for your brevity.
You are my kind of commissioner. I
You
have
are
to say.
totally. If we could clone you,
You've
we
gone
would.
right to the top after 8 years here.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
He'll be chair for life.
So,
So
first-
who's? Does someone want? What? What? Commissioner Fresco, you ready to do something?
Yeah, I say, go with it. Come back with red line. I think we're done. I mean, I feel like we don't have anything else to discuss.
And they're coming back with the red line, so
Yeah, so let's see what it looks like and we'll nitpick from there. But I think that, I think that this is what we have to do. We have to let the future invent itself.
That's very profound.
Thank you.
Commissioner McKinnon.
So I do think the first thing about this project vision is it's a little bit lengthy. I would make it a much more active thing. 3rd Street is the heart of downtown Santa Monica and represents our community's values. You've got it as if it's gone away. It's never gone away. But let's make it a statement of what we really believe it to be, which is it's direct and it's on point and it reflects our communities. So the second thing I'd say is that the problem with the promenade, despite what everyone says, and Commissioner Landis reminded me of it, I never go there. No one ever goes to the promenade.
I do.
There's too many people, It's the thing you
Yogi
hear.
Berra.
But the truth is, we actually need more people there at certain key times.
Right.
And it's more people that will drive the engagement that we really want. And we're designing how to get people there at the right time, particularly a nighttime economy. And so how we think about that conditions how we think about the whole thing. And one of the issues is when people talk about, there's too many restaurants on the promenade, there really aren't enough restaurants there, so that when people come down, there's a diversity of choice. People have changed the way they eat. If you look at Lincoln Mall in Miami, or a whole bunch of places, there's brackets of restaurants and people come and sit in the centre and eat different sorts of food and so on. So I'm less concerned about that. What I do think is because of the price of the rent, that there aren't smaller startups that can get going. That's where promenade adjacent becomes important. That's our alleys, where you get smaller spaces that can become startups, whether it's in surfboard making or candlestick making, or some guy who does Australian coffee for the first time, or Slovakian coffee for all that matters, or is brewing something. And whereas we don't mind that big space, the billboard on the promenade, what we've got to look at is encouraging and enhancing that smaller scale operation at the back of the store. I mean, there is a guy who already makes furniture on 3rd Street. It's 3rd Street. 3rd Court. He's between, I think, Arizona and so on. There's the comedy club, there's the jiu-jitsu people. So people have already colonised it. Our job is to encourage that as fast as possible. And I think when you look at a nighttime economy, it comes back to giving people what they want. And they want to be able to drink in small, intimate spaces, and people need to be able to start that up. You want some people to be able to enjoy music, whether it's passive music. This commission put a condition on Elefante of 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock for live music. Do you recall that as part of the CUP process for the theatres? And so what we created was a recorded music industry rather than a live music industry. And we've seen on Pico at McCabe's that live music draws people. There are lines outside there every single night. We want those lines in the downtown. And then there is a market for people who want to go out and have a drink later at night. And this downtown is perfect for it. We have a gazillion parking spots. We have Uber off the charts. So let's drive that. And the issue then becomes, how do we regulate it? That's what cops are for. And that's what we're looking at. How do we maintain some sense of order on the street? So we don't want disorder. We don't want a West Hollywood. But I think we want a range of options that allow people to pick from sit-down bigger chains to small intimate places where you go and you have a drink at 10 or 11 o'clock when you finish a planning commission meeting, which we currently can't do. Now that Swingers is closed. And so...
La Cabana.
interesting. I've never been invited to those places by you, but you know, that's for the future. So driving that, because the downtown is dead in the evening, and yet we have the infrastructure in place like no other part of Los Angeles, and we want to invigorate that. And I think the things that you've put forward here are good insofar as they go, but I think you need to drive it a lot harder. And certainly the role of how we allow places to serve alcohol is a really key one. And I would take it away from us unless you have it on appeal and give it to the planning director. And that will encourage flexibility. So uniform rules that enable certainty, allow smallness to flourish and allow diversity is where we need to get to. And obviously there are other thoughts about promenade needs their anchor at the north end. Should we open up Arizona to foot traffic and so on, for a different discussion. But driving and allowing this change from what we've got, which is static and dead, into something that's alive and vibrant and people are walking around and enjoying selecting different bars and nightclubs and stuff, that's an important part of what we need to do. So go for it. It would be my suggestion.
Commissioner Landers.
So I want to echo some of that, but really draw a couple of threads together that I think we've heard. One, Commissioner Reese, Commissioner McKinnon, both alluded to this idea of pushing decisions down from the Planning Commission, away from the Planning Commission, simplifying the process, and really making it administrative wherever that's possible. And I think what that to me says from a process standpoint is, let's think expansively about how we can do that, how we can simplify the administrative process as much as possible, make the conditions extremely clear, make it easy for people to either meet them or not meet them, and be able to make decisions for themselves and their economic decision making. The second piece is, however we're thinking about it, obviously technology has changed substantially. It's changed substantially in the last 30 years, whether it's the definition of a TV screen, which this is a TV screen, right? To the way we might use technology in terms of bollards going up and down, key card access for people who have the rights to 24/7, driving passes for certain vehicles but not other vehicles, preference for electric vehicles over non-electric vehicles. We have, even the notion of whether a kitchen is closed. The closure of a kitchen no longer means that we can't serve food anymore. I mean, there are retail spaces with no hoods that are actually serving all kinds of foods because we can now legally do things with microwaves and refrigerators that don't require any plumbing or hoods or anything like that. So I think thinking expansively about how the new realities could lead to new forms of permission and regulation, I would encourage you to go broad as possible, and take advantage of whatever tools are possible. The second thing is, when we're talking about limited industry, I do think, Kathleen, you used the phrase, the experiential retail. I do think that these makers, and use the word makerspace, I do think that's vital. The notion that you could watch somebody making a surfboard is really cool. The notion that you could learn to brew your own beer by taking a brewing class somewhere and people walking by could see that would be really, whether it's beer or kombucha or cider or whatever it is, those kinds of experiences I think will draw people to the promenade of all ages. And if we can think about that limited industry, whether it's having the coffee roaster there and also learning to roast your coffee, right? So we're not thinking about the dry cleaner, the service provider who's just going to take a whole bunch of space and use it, and we'd have to worry about when the shipments go out. But think about those small scale production opportunities that also bring people off the street to engage in it, at different times. And that leads to the last point, which I think goes back to some of the things we've been talking about in the task force. And just reflecting on the conversation, it's something that I haven't heard, which is we've done a lot of observing of who's there. We've done a lot of observing of when the promenade is silent. I think what we haven't really talked about is who's missing. Who's there and who's missing. Families Is it people? I mean, Commissioner McKinnon was getting at it in terms of the people who want to go see a movie and then go out for a drink. Who are those folks? Are they people in their 20s, 30s, 40s? Are we ethnically and racially diverse? Are we gender diverse? Is this a gender inclusive? Is this a safe space for women after 11 o'clock at night? Is this a safe space for trans people 24 hours a day? Is this right? So can we think as we're thinking through these uses, are we thinking about the populations who are present and need to be supported? And are we thinking about the populations who are absent and wondering what it will take to grow those particular communities? Because once those communities are more present, then it becomes much easier for retailers to imagine a business serving specific people. Because retail isn't for the generic average person. There is no generic average person. So I just want to encourage that kind of thinking. I know you can't zone for that, but I hope that it would inform the conversations about uses and how we activate the alleys.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to say what I'm going to say. One of the thoughts I had when Sean mentioned the strudel and the lace and the surfboards, what have you, I don't think that any, other than I'm hungry, I don't think that there's any way any of those industries could make it on the promenade given the rents. I mean, that's not realistic. But what I saw when I was in Russia, as long as we're dropping names of places we've been, is facilities where there were multiple artisans and craftspeople in one space, and that might work. And it might have to be something off an alley because the rent's too high on the promenade. But I think that would be an extremely interesting thing to pursue. I don't know what in the code, probably there's something in the code that prohibits it. But if so, then we should look at that. Because I think that would be a very interesting, interactive, nice little commercial, local artisan kind of thing to look at. The other thing, and then I don't want to get into a philosophical discussion of the authenticity of the promenade. I mean, I've lived in Santa Monica for 40 years, and it has changed, and the demographics of Santa Monica have changed drastically. So I unfortunately, I suspect that crafting a promenade that is going to be socially and economically as diverse as we would like it to be is probably not that realistic a goal from the standpoint of the rents and the prices that are associated with those rents. We can try. And for me, the authenticity of the promenade is the buildings. I mean, I think really that I relate to the buildings on the promenade, and they're not going anywhere, I don't think, except for Apple. So, I mean, I think we have to be open to the fact that, well, what is authentic? I mean, it's changing, and it's certainly, I was actually on the Planning Commission in the 1980s. You didn't even include that on your chart when the promenade first came forward with a specific plan. There's still some of us still alive who are back there. What?
That's why the buildings are so messed up. It's because it wasn't on the radar enough.
Was that my fault?
No. Well, maybe
Okay.
a little.
I assume all fault, so that's fine. So I want to like pair what others have said, and that is I think just go for it. There's nothing in here that I think is beyond reason, and I think it's a good approach, and fine tune it and fill it out and come back to us, and we can talk more focused than we have tonight. And thank you all for all the hard work you've done, all of you. Commissioner Reese.
I'll do this pretty quickly. I think an IZO is a great idea because we need to have a test case and see how it works out. I think going broad with the types of uses, and the problem is in this world is we have no idea what the use that's going to be there in 2 years that's going to be hot, and allowing some kind of flexibility where the staff can say, yes, this is a consistent use. We might not have anticipated before, but it's consistent and go in makes a lot of sense to me. And I like the idea of trying to do it so it's administrative. The only other comment I'm going to make is, and I probably take a couple of hits for this, but in the project goals, the number one goal, when I first read that, I just thought that was so out of place. That was our Santa Monicans' living room where we gather, dine, and shop. I look at the promenade as a kind of an economic engine for the city where we want to drive tourism to that area and reap the benefits of the sales tax and that we get from there. I don't see it. I see the beach might be our living room. This might be a nice guest room But but it's not, to me, it's not where my family goes and recreates. They go there once in a while, but so anyways, that's just a statement that I want to throw out there. But other than that, I think you guys are, looking in the right direction. I think it's a really hard issue and trying to anticipate what's going to be effective for the next 10 years.
Thank you. Commissioner McKinnon.
Specifically, you do need to look at the 35% rule. You need to look at dancing, and you need to look at how we would craft regulations that would allow small bars. I keep differentiating, so we're not got 1,000 people just drinking, but smaller places which would allow people to gather where they predominantly drink and you're not serving a lot of food. And do they only open at 6 in the evening? Whatever it is, I think everything's on the table here, and the discussion is how do you bring it back to us in this area of the city so that we can move forward on it. Don't leave it out because you think, oh, that's not going to get through. And we follow on from Commissioner Reese, the more we can drive it down, make it administrative, make it easy, flexible, so that we're going forward quickly. I mean, look, 8 years ago, we didn't allow a Tesla showroom on the promenade, and there it is, and that's really done something great. So, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so to bring this to a conclusion, I just want to say, what was I going to say? No, I know this is actually sort of from 30,000 feet. I know that we've gotten correspondence from people who oppose drinking and don't want more alcohol consumed on the promenade and we hear that all the time. I think a really important thing to remember is the people who are there at 3 o'clock in the afternoon are likely not going to be the people who are there at midnight. It's hard to imagine that. But if the people enjoy the promenade at 3 o'clock, they have to understand that it has to be economically sustainable. And that means it has to have a nightlife, and it has to have money coming in as part of that nightlife for those 3 p.m. people to enjoy the promenade. And I think that point needs to be made. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just say one little historical note? In the 1890s, when the city was passing its first liquor rules, one of the rules was that family members could put a letter on file telling the city which people couldn't be served. So
Wow.
I thought you might want to consider that.
Well, that's an idea. Okay, thank you. Do you feel you have enough direction from us? Perfect. All right, I've lost my agenda. What is next? Future
but
agenda items for the commissioners.
Look into the flying car. That's Commissioner Fresco's
Yeah,
favourite.
we're going to bring that back.
We lost it from
Not
the
that it
corner
was
of
ever here.
Colorado and Fifth
Okay.
there some years ago. So.
Okay, thank you. Future commission agenda items. I think we talked about a lot of that during the staff to director's report. Written communications. Do we have any? Speaking of which, I need some TA real soon on my city email. I've probably broken it. Okay. Public input? Wow. Is there a motion to adjourn? God, it's 9 o'clock. Huh? I can? Yeah. Okay, you are adjourned.